So we are now entering memory part 2. We're finished with memory part 1. We're entering memory part 2. And I'm going to go through the section called timer. And then we have a couple more sections here. I have marked them as optional. I am not going to go through them because I think it would be more fun if we move further to, I have actually 2 alternatives for you there, what we move further to, but let's get there first, and then I'll ask you what you think. All right, so memory part 2 timer, what it is about. Here is my game. I can play it. I have played it in the end of the previous session before the break. And so I can win this game, right? But I'm not getting any score, right? And we talked about this timer yesterday, that this thing here, the status in the status bar, should actually be updated every second. And it should every second tell us how much time has passed since we started playing, since we started clicking. So this is what we're going to be implementing. Also, there is this functionality to think about. If I have started the game, the timer starts when I click restart button. The timer should show me 0 again, and it should not run. So this restart button resets the timer, and it doesn't continue going, right? And when the timer should start? Well, when we start clicking. Click on any card, the timer should start going. Yes? So how do we implement this timer? In order to do that, we should know what the start time is. So when I click on some card, I should save the point and time when I made my first click. And this, by point in time, I actually mean something called timestamp. Do you know what a timestamp is? So timestamp is a standard that is widely used for describing time, and it's normally it's a millisecond representation. So it's a number of milliseconds since a particular date. And this date actually is 1st January of 1970 at midnight. So this is like an anchor for calculating any date. So say, for example, that I have, I'm gonna show you. So today, right now, how many milliseconds have gone since the 1st of January 1970? Very easy to find out. You go to your browser console and you write date.now. And this is what you get as the result. This is also something called Unix time sometimes. There is a site that I often use, and it's called Epoch Converter. Unix timestamp converter. And it takes a number of milliseconds, and it can translate it into human date. So if I get a value like this, a timestamp value, I can, for example, paste it here and get what the date is. Say that, for example, and what the time, exactly what hour, minute, and second, millisecond of that, of the time. So if sometimes the milliseconds are omitted, it's a bit different. It's either seconds or milliseconds. Date.now, this gives us milliseconds in JavaScript. This is the important part, what we need to know. And say that I want to, let's test if I was right. I'm gonna convert 0. Yeah, you see, 0 corresponds to Thursday, the 1st of January, 1970. Oh, I remember it like yesterday. I wasn't born. So that's the 0. And then we can represent any date, any time with just one number. And this is a very easy and nice way to handle dates. So they're just a number of milliseconds since 0, since 1st of January, 1970. And when I say date, yeah, it's not just the date, like 24th of October, which is my birthday. It's also the time. So hours, minutes, seconds, and sometimes milliseconds as well. So any point in time can be represented with one single number. How cool is that? I think it's kind of cool. And then you can do mathematical operations on it. Like, for example, okay, I have this number that represents now. And say that I want to set some kind of deadline, an hour after. Well, then I should add 1,000. I'm just going to write it so that you see what I'm saying. 1,000, because this is how many milliseconds there are in a second. And then I write times 60, that's how many seconds there are in a minute. So this is number of minutes times 60. That's now I have 1 hour expressed in milliseconds. And what did I say? I said the deadline. I forgot. I think I said 1 hour, right? Say that for example, something should happen in 1 hour. Then I'm setting the deadline to be date plus now, the date.now plus this number. And I can program it somewhere in my code that exactly at this point in time, something should happen. I don't know, fireworks or whatever. And what kind of intervals we're gonna be using? Well, we want something to happen every second. So we're gonna have a start time. So we're gonna save date.now in our state. So we're gonna create a state variable where we save the start time. And then we're gonna have another variable called elapsed time. So how much time that has gone since the start time. And we're gonna be updating elapsed time every second. So say that this is our start time, then our elapsed time will be updated to this plus 1,000. And then in the next iteration to this next number plus 1,000 and so forth. This is kind of how we want it to work. And then we can use So yes, wait a second. I think I confused myself and maybe yourself a little bit. We are gonna have start time, which represents a point in time. And we're going to have elapsed time, which represents the number of milliseconds that have gone since then. So say, for example, I say here in my console, let start time equals date.now. I have saved it in a variable just a couple seconds ago. So if I check start time, it's this time, right? If I check it again, it's still the same. I have saved it in a variable. And then I'm gonna have another variable called elapsed time. And elapsed time is gonna be date.now, which is another time, which is the time that is right now when I click enter, minus start time. Right, so start time is a point in time, maybe a minute ago, and date.now is a point in time, which is now. And now both of them are a number of milliseconds. And when I subtract when I say date.now minus start time, I get the number of milliseconds that has passed since I saved my start time. So when I press this now, my elapsed time is gonna tell me how much time has gone since I started explaining start time. Are you with me? So I'm gonna enter, and then I'm gonna check elapsed time, 91,000 milliseconds, so 91 seconds, but 1.5 minutes. There. So this is kind of how it's going to work. These are those two state variables that we're going to work with: start time and elapsed time. And then which one of them are we going to use in order to display this? Is it start time or is it elapsed time? I think I saw someone's lips whispering. Elapsed time. That's correct. So we can give our status bar now the correct time, and we're going to be updating our status bar every second. We're going to tell it, hey, update yourself. Hey, update yourself. Hey, update yourself. Hey, update yourself. And we're going to be sending new text, new status text to it every second. Update yourself, update yourself. So that's what we're going to be doing. And these two variables are going to be in our state. Also, let's think about start time for a bit. When we start our game, or I mean, when we load the page like this, what should our start time be? It's a bit like, it's a decision that we need to make. I told you that the start time, the important thing is that start time should be set to some particular point in time when we actually start the game. When we actually click a card. Now the start time should be set to date now. But when we are in this state, let's call it pause state, like nothing is happening, I'm not playing. And this state we have either when we haven't started yet, or we have played for a bit and then we click restart button. These are the two situations when our timer should not be ticking and it should be just showing 0. So I'm going to decide that start time is going to be 0, just to have it as a value that describes that this is a paused state and nothing should be happening. I'm saying the start time is 1st of January 1970. And that's when nobody played my memory game, and I know that. Okay. So, how do we do something every second in JavaScript? So maybe you have seen something similar to this implementation, something that should be, for example, blinking. Like say that we have a really annoying website where we have a blinking commercial. Our customer said, oh, this banner here, it should blink red every second and annoy all the visitors on the page. Then we are using a function called set interval in JavaScript. So I'm maybe gonna show you a little bit how it works. So in the beginning of my memory component, I'm just gonna write some test code. Like if you want, you can write it somewhere in some notes or something. I just want to make sure that this code runs when I open my memory component. That's it, for easy testing. So in JavaScript, if you want to say, I want to do this every second, then you call a function, it's a standard function that is called set interval. And this function takes two parameters. The first parameter, could you guess? What do we like sending into a function? Another function. So we tell set interval what should be executed every second, for example, or every interval, every some amount of time. So say, for example, that I just want to write the current date to the console, like current number of milliseconds to the console. That's just my test to show you how this works. So I'm going to send a function that prints something to this console. So I can just write here console.log. I'm going to need to send a function. So it doesn't take any parameters. So empty parentheses, arrow, and then I'm going to do my console.log. And what I'm going to log is date.now. So this thing I want to do every second. And the second parameter that set interval takes is the number of milliseconds. It should repeat this. So if I want something to be executed every second, I'm sending what? Anybody has an answer? So the second parameter to set interval is the number of milliseconds that pass in between the calls to this function. This is like how often I should execute this function. So it takes a number of milliseconds. And I want this function to be run every second. So what should I type here?
Is it 1000?
Yes, exactly. So I want this function to be called every 1000 of milliseconds, right? And it's milliseconds because, well, it's very often we use milliseconds and not whole seconds. Do you know, like when we're gonna be building Snake, it is gonna move on the screen and it's gonna move once per second. That's extremely slow, actually. So we're gonna be using something like half a second, maybe. That's more natural. So very often you use something less than 1 second. So when memory renders, this code is gonna be run. So when I enter the memory component, I'm gonna set interval that is gonna do console log of the current milliseconds value. So it's gonna print lots of large values there. So let us see if that works. I'm saving this and I don't think I'm running it anywhere. Gonna close these pages. Maybe this one too. Let's close everything. Yeah. So, and then I do npm start. So I have not rendered my memory component yet, right? Because the components that are being shown on the page right now are the app, the root component, the navigation component, and the home component. So when I click memory, this is when it's going to be rendered. This is when the code inside our function memory is going to be run. So when I click there, I'm expecting some numbers to show up in the console. There. Every second, do you see that the fourth number from the end is the one changing? Yeah? So this should make sense. Let's make it a little prettier. Let's actually save a variable here. Let's call it start time. Const start time. You don't need to write after me. This is just a demonstration of set interval. You can write it into some notes file if you want. So const start time is date.now. And then, so I have saved the start time. And right after I have saved it, I'm going to be setting interval that is going to print console log date.now. So the date at every point the printing happens minus start time. So this is something saved forever. And then we have a function that is run every second. And it compares date.now to start time. It takes the difference between date.now and start time. So what values do we expect to be printed then? Do you have any feeling? Are you feeling it? So we say the start time, it's some timestamp, and then right away we say every second check the difference between date now, which is the actual date of the printing to the console. Take that timestamp minus start time. And do that every second. The first time this function will be run is 1 second later. So the difference between date now and start time should be roughly, and I'm not saying exactly, I don't think it will work exactly like that, but roughly 1000 milliseconds. Next time it's gonna print it. It's gonna print 2,000 something. Next time 3,000 and so forth. I need you to understand this and why it works like that. So let's make sure. You see, it's roughly plus 1,000 milliseconds every time. Working quite well, I would say. So, does anybody have questions about this code? Why it does what it does? No? Then we move on. Let us introduce the new state variable, and then we'll see how we can use this functionality to update it. So 2 state variables, as I mentioned before, start time and elapsed time. So I'm gonna comment this out. Okay. So normally it's nice to put all the state things that we define in one place, and that's normally the top of the component. So right now we have use state with this game state. And thing is, we can actually, I think I'll continue here because this comment here is talking about this. Maybe I'll move it up. Like that. So here I defined my game state, and I can actually use this function use state multiple times in the same component. So I can kind of divide my whole state for the component into logical parts. So we have one part that is game, and it has everything to do with cards. And now we have the timer part, and that's kind of separate from the game part, from the cards at least. And sometimes there are other reasons for why you want to use state many times. I think we will go through it a bit later. So how do I add another state variable? I use the same syntax, use state. And I can use the same syntax here. So what I write is const array, and then I come up with 2 variables. The first variable that I come up with is what's the name of the state variable that I'm creating, and it is start time. Now that I have the name start time, my second variable here is going to be the same, but a set function for it. Set start time. And where these variables come from? They come from the call to use state. So why I write like this is because I know that use state returns an array, and there are 2 things in the array, and I give those 2 things names, start time and set start time. It's similar to the object decomposition thing we talked about before, where I knew I was sending a game object to my set game, and I knew that we had cards and first card and second card in it, and I gave those and I use those variables. And now again, I know that use state returns an array of two things. One thing is the current state, and the second thing is a function for updating the state. And then I just need to come up with variables for those two things. So my state variable I'm creating is start time. The second thing here is set start time, which is a function I'm going to be using to update this state. Use state takes a parameter, and it's the initial value for the state. What did we say the initial value for start time should be? Exactly, 0. So 0 means the timer is not ticking. So this is start time. We also want elapsed time. So it's another state variable that we're going to create. How to do that? I think you can do it yourself. Or you can look at what I do. So what I have here is another state variable called elapsed time. So I have elapsed time, set elapsed time, and then I'm calling use state. And what's the initial value of elapsed time? It can also be 0, right? No time has passed and we haven't started the timer, so it kind of makes sense. There. So first thing we can do is we can set start time to a specific point in time when somebody clicks a card. Do you remember we said that? The timer should start ticking when somebody clicks a card. And where can we put that code then? How about the on card clicked function? That seems like the logical way to go. So on card clicked, what it does here is it looks, did we click on an already flipped card, then return, don't set game. Otherwise, set game and update our state. This is what on card clicked function does. So we could, for example, somewhere at the end of this method, sometimes I say function, sometimes I say method, because I'm very used to object-oriented programming since my LTH days. I should be using the word function. If you hear me saying method, I mean function. So on card click does two things. Checks if the clicked card is flipped, and in that case exits, or does set game. And look and find where the set game ends. It should be curly brace, closing parenthesis, and then a semicolon before the curling brace that closes the set game function. So here we are after calling, as I meant before the curly brace that closes the on card click function. So after the set game call, we want to set our timer. So we have calculated the game state and we have updated the state for the game. Now we should also update the state for the start time because somebody just clicked the card, right? So one thing we can do, let's start writing some code and then look at it and critique it. So one thing I can do is say set start time and then send date.now. Am I doing that right then? What this results in that every time I click, I'm going to be setting my start time to the time of the click. And that doesn't seem right? Because first time I click a card, that's when I should save it. Second time I click a card, I shouldn't reset my start time. My start time should be a set point in time, right? The time of the first click at it. So then to solve it, we could actually do a little bit of conditional logic. We could say that, okay, somebody clicked a card. Is the timer started? Is start time 0 or not? Because if it is 0, if it is not started, then we should start it. Then we should set it to date now. Otherwise, if it is 0, then we shouldn't reset it to a new value. Did I say it right? If it is 0, we should set it to date now. But if it isn't 0, it means that there was a previous click and we have already saved the timer at that point. We shouldn't reset it to a new value. So this means that set start time depends on its previous version, right? It depends on the old start time. So old start time can be either 0 or some value. If it is 0, we will change it. If it's not, we won't. Therefore, let's pass a function here. Just like we did with set game, we passed a function. We took old game as parameter, calculated new game. Here's what I'm talking about. It took old game as parameter, calculated the new game and returned it. Here. Now we're gonna do set start time and pass a function. It will take old start time and return a new one, depending on the value of old start time. And now we can use an if statement. If old start time is 0, return date now, else return old start time. That's what I want to say, but I'm not going to use an if else. I'm going to show you a shorter way to write an if else. We are going to write, we check old start time. Is it equal to 0? This is what our if condition is. And then we type question mark. So here's the condition. And then we have question mark. It's like asking a question, I kind of like it. And then after that, we have two different things that should happen depending on the value, true or false. The first thing is for the true case. If the old start time was 0, we should return date.now. I'm not typing return here because I'm not using curly braces for this. I'm using a value here right away. Then I don't need to write return. So date now is the true option. And what is the false option? We type colon, and then we give the false option. So if old start time is 0, if this is true, we should set it to date.now. If it's not 0, then we shouldn't change it. Then we should just return old start time, unchanged. There. So now we have set start time. You know what we could do to test if this works? We could use our start time variable. Here it is. This is what the current start time at the rendering of this component is. Not just the first rendering, at every render. So this whole code runs every time a component is being rendered. When it's rendered for the first time, these values are the ones that we have in these variables. When it's rendered next time, then we can forget about these values. And these variables, start time and elapsed time, will be the ones having the current value at the time of the other renders. This might be hard to grasp, but I'm hoping if I tell you this many times, it will go in at some point. So these variables, start time, elapsed time, also game, are the current value of the state. That's how you can think. Current value at the time of the component being rendered. And it's being rendered many, many times. Every time we click, it's being rendered. So let's just display our start time, say in our status bar for fun. And we want to see so that when we click a card, our status bar says a huge number, because that's the timestamp, the start time value. The way we do it is, so right now it says time 0 seconds. Let's change it to start time. And now we're gonna use a JavaScript expression here instead of plain string. So we need curly braces around. So let's erase 0 seconds and then add plus. So time, colon, space, and then plus start time like that. Oh, I have saved and my code has reformatted. I hope you can still follow. So time and then plus start time. I'm gonna test it now. So I have saved my file. I have my Webpack server running, meaning I had npm start. And on the right here, I have my web page that is being updated every time I make change in the code, right? And save. So I'm expecting now that when I click a card, the timer will say time, colon, and then some large number, which is the date now value of when I click the card. Yes? Another important thing is that when I continue clicking, this number should not change, right? The start time does not change. Great. And then another piece of functionality for start time is when we click restart, it should be set to what? Yes, 0. So Let's add that. Go to your onRestart function. What it does at the moment, it sets the game to its initial value. It resets the whole game, right? Cards, first card and second card. But after set game, we also want to reset our start time. And this time is very easy. It doesn't depend on the previous version of start time. We can just plainly tell our set start time function, your new value is 0. Like that. So what is the set start time function? Where does it come from? We obtained it from useState. useState gave us a value and a function. The start time value currently at the time of rendering, and the set start time function for updating this state. So this is part of our state. This is part of our state. So start time and elapsed time is also a part of our state. So let's test this. I am clicking a card. I see time, big number. I continue clicking. It doesn't change. This is great. And then press restart and it becomes 0 again. So far so good. But it's not the start time value that we want to display, right? We want to display the elapsed time. We want to show this is how long has passed since the start time. So every second we want to tell the user, this is how many milliseconds have passed since you started clicking, since the start time. And this value should be updated every second. This is just what I showed you before in the console of my DevTools in Chrome using set interval. So this code is kind of what I want to write for my elapsed time. Question is only, where do I place the call to set interval? How do I update my elapsed time every second? Because the problem is that I cannot just plainly in my component here write set interval. Something, something. You know why? Because this code, this set interval code, will then be run every time the component renders. Every time I click a card, for example, it will create lots of unnecessary timers or intervals. I'm just going to call them intervals because the function is called set interval. So interval in my meaning is we can say a background process that does something every, for example, second. That's an interval. So I say set interval and then I give it a function. Do this in the background every second. That's my background process, we can say. So since I cannot put it here, I am going to be using a new hook that is available in React, and it is called useEffect. It is a very, very powerful hook. It has a lot of things that I like about it. So fasten your seatbelts now, and I'm going to explain to you how it works. So we have use state, that's one hook we used before. Now we're looking at use effect, that's another hook we're going to be looking at. It's also available in the React library, and we're going to import it along with use state up here, use effect, like that. So the idea of it is that I want something to happen kind of in the background of my application. So I'm gonna first write a call to use effect. It's also a function, and I'm gonna tell you what parts it consists of. It doesn't return anything. We are just calling it, so use effect. And then it takes two parameters. The first parameter is the function of this background process that we want, like something that should happen. So the first parameter is a function describing what should happen, what effect should happen. And the second parameter is something called a dependency array. So I think I described the use state somewhere here at the top, like that in the morning. Like what the signature of this function is, how to think about it when we use it. Use state takes initial state, returns current state, and function to update the state. Now we're gonna write a similar comment to explain use effect here. It doesn't return anything. At least as far as I know, it's been changed. I haven't seen it returning anything. And then it takes two parameters. The first one is function, or we can say effect function, like what effect should run. And the second parameter is something that is called a dependency array. Like that. So an array of things. And it is optional. In some cases, you don't need to send it. So use effect. And let's create a simple function that does a console log again, so that we don't need to think about that function also. So function doing console log, and let's just print date now there. And then the next parameter, so dependency array means when should this effect occur, depending on what. And if we don't send anything here, I'm gonna write dependency array, different values, undefined, meaning I'm not sending any parameter, then it's undefined. Means that the effect will be run on every render. Effect function will be run on every render. Second, we have empty array. That means that effect will run only on the first render. So if we want to start some background process right when the component renders, and it's the only time when we want to do it, then we can do it, then we can send an empty array as the second parameter, so like that. As a second parameter here. And then third case, if we are sending some value in the array or many values. The result is effect will run when any of the values change. And this is great. This is very powerful. Where this means that, for example, we can track changes in our state. So for example, every time start time changes, maybe something should happen. Or every time elapsed time changes, maybe something should happen. Or maybe every time game changes, something should happen. So it's now up to you to build this dependency how you want. So you can create one state variable, for example, and then you create an effect saying that every time that variable changes, I want to do this. And it's very handy to have. So another thing that useEffect does is that it has a possibility to clean up after itself. And this is kind of why we're going to use it, one of the reasons. So it's like this. Say that we are in the memory component and we have started the timer. And then we click on another game button. I mean, on the snake, for example. It means that we unmount the component. It will disappear from the DOM, right? We say bye-bye to the component. We forget its state. And yeah, and that's it. It just disappears. But the thing is, if we have created a timer in that component, and then we leave the component, but the timer is kind of still there dangling, actually React takes care of that, but it doesn't like it. It tells us you have a memory leak in your application that you are not cleaning up. So there is a way to clean up a timer. And this is important for us, right? Once I have called setInterval, I haven't told you how to stop it, right? So if we've called the function setInterval, how do we stop it? I can show you. So here, there is another part to this function, setInterval. It actually returns something called interval ID. So we can say const interval ID equals setInterval, la la la. And then in order to clean this interval, we can call, there is a standard function, once again, it's called clearInterval. And what it wants is, it wants to know exactly what interval are we cleaning up now? Well, this one, the interval ID, is how we identify what should be clean. So if I were to run memory now, actually no interval would be created. I mean, we wouldn't see any updates because what we do here is We create an interval, so set interval, and then we're clearing it right away. And there basically passes no time between this call and this call. So it will never have time to print anything to the console. So we tell this interval, print the date or yeah, the difference in time every second. So start in a second, but right when we tell it that, we say, oh, by the way, forget about it. Disappear, I'm clearing you. So that's why nothing will happen if we run this code. We won't see any updates like that. So this is how you clear it. I'm gonna comment out this code. And this clearing functionality is very nice. How can we use it in useEffect? So I'm gonna tell you one more thing about useEffect. This first parameter, it's a function, right? It's the effect itself, something that should run depending on the situation, depending on what we say here. Right now we're saying run this effect only on the first render. We are not depending on any variables here. So then this function that we pass as the first argument, let us make some space for it. So I'm giving it curly braces. So here is the function. This function can return how to clean up after itself. So this function returns a cleanup function. So the world of functions is huge right now, right? useEffect is a function that takes in a function that returns a function. This is what I'm telling you now. useEffect is a function that takes in a function that returns a function. No parameters. And then this function is supposed to clean up after the effect. Okay, how do we clean up? Well, if we're just writing console log, there is nothing to clean up. But if we are creating an interval, then we need to do a cleanup after ourselves. I'm also going to explain you when this cleanup happens in a second. So let's first set this interval. So I'm going to steal this code from here. Or no, I told you that you shouldn't write after me there. So I'm going to write it again. Where was I? Here, useEffect, right? And we pass a function to it. Inside this function, we will be creating an interval. So set interval. And what this interval is gonna do, so inside the interval, again, a function, and then comma, something that happens every second. So I'm gonna add comma 1000 right away. So set interval, what did we say it should do? It should update our elapsed time, right? So we have start time and we have elapsed time. Elapsed time right now is 0 and we're not doing anything with it. Now we should start doing something with it. So here we are gonna say, every second I want to update my state for the elapsed time. So I'm gonna use this set elapsed time function. that use state gave me. Set elapsed time, and what should it be equal to? Actually, it doesn't depend on its previous value. Of course, we could do like that, like set elapsed time to its previous value plus 1000. Previous value plus 1000. Then it would go in the value exactly 0, 1000, 2000, 3000, and so forth. But it's more precise if we take date.now minus start time, just like we were doing in the top here. Remember console log date now minus start time, and we saw like 1003, 2001, something like that. So that's what we're going to be setting our elapsed time to. Set elapsed time, we send date.now minus start time. And after we have created this interval, we should return a function that cleans it up. How to clean it up? Well, we need to first know the interval ID. So we create const interval ID equals set interval const. And then we return a function that clears interval ID. So empty parenthesis, arrow, clear interval. Clear interval. And then we send in interval ID. There. So what is going to happen now? Now we are saying to use effect, do this only the first time we render the memory component. You see, I'm sending empty array as the second argument. It means effect. The effect here is this. This will run on every, will run only on the first render. So this is just an example for now to see that this holds, that this is correct. So what are we expecting then? We are setting elapsed time, right? So let's print elapsed time somewhere. Let's use our status bar again. So elapsed time, I am going to insert it in the status of the status bar. Here's the property I'm sending to the status bar. It says right now time, start time. I'm going to say time elapsed time instead. Save. You see what's happening? I'm having large numbers that update every second. Here. So I have created an effect. The effect updates elapsed time. Every second it sets elapsed time to the difference between now and the 1st of January of 1970. Because this is what start time is. At the beginning of the game, it's 0. So this is not exactly what we want. We don't want the timer to tick already. So let's add a little condition here. Use effect. The timer, this interval, it should only be created if start time is not 0, right? We should only start updating our elapsed time. We should only start the timer if start time is not 0. This is what we said before. 0 for the start time means we are on hold. We're not doing anything. We're not taking the time. So I'm gonna add to this use effect, if start time is not 0, then do all of this, including the return. Because if we are not creating any timers, if we're not doing that, we are not going to return anything to clean up after ourselves, because there's nothing to clean up. Okay? So now this use effect will be run actually only on the first render, and it will start our timer. Does it work for us? I don't think so. So the first time the component renders, this code will run. It won't create the interval because start time is 0. Will it create it later? I don't think so, because this code only runs on the first render. You see, as I'm clicking a render, all of this code is run again. But the use effect, we are passing this function and we're saying this should only happen on the first render. So how do we make it work so that this interval is created when the start time changes? We can add it to the dependency array. So then every time start time changes, we will run this function. And when does the start time change for the first time? Maybe somebody can answer? The start time is 0, yes? So the start time is 0 at the beginning of the game. When does it change? Exactly. I like how you're developing your like I don't know what this is. Body language is not really that. Silent language. Okay, so anytime or the first time actually that somebody clicks, that's when we set our start time. And if we put it in the dependency array here, then our use effect, then this function will be run every time start time changes. So first time ever when the component is rendered, what happens is start time is 0. We look here. Is it not 0? No. So nothing will happen. If statement won't be executed here. Then we start clicking. So start time changes to something. And then this function will be run again. This is how useEffect works. It looks at its dependency array. And then we check, is start time not 0? Yes. Then create an interval that updates elapsed time every second to date now minus start time. And then this is how to clean up after this effect. So let's see if this works now. The component has rendered for the first time. The timer is not ticking. And now I click a card. It starts ticking because start time has changed. Right? And now about the cleanup function. So I'm gonna tell you here, I've told you about effect function, dependency array, different values of dependency array, how it affects the time when this function, the first parameter, will run. And then I'm gonna tell you about the cleanup, when the cleanup happens. When does this function run? So firstly, effect function returns a cleanup function, optional. We don't have to return a cleanup function, but if we do, so in this case we do. So effect function returns a cleanup function that runs next time the effect function is run, or when the component unmounts, disappears from the DOM. So, example, again, we start the game, start time is 0. We don't create any interval. This is not run. useEffect depends on start time. So next time we set the start time to something, this function will be run. You know what? I was planning to create an Excel. You wouldn't guess that, would you? It's just because I want to show you a little table, and it's nice to explain this with a table. So imagine every row here is gonna be different renders of our memory component. First render, we have start time. It has value 0. And then after a while, it will have some value, some start time. Oh, let's say, I don't know, it's a large number, right? Some value. And later, when somebody clicks restart, it will become 0 again. And then later we start playing again, and it will be some other number. Right? And so it goes. Start time is 0, then some number, 0, then some number. And every time its value changes, this useEffect function will be run. Now, let's describe what this function does. Effect. What happens when start time is 0? Nothing. We don't create anything. We have, if start time is not 0, then we do something. Otherwise, when it is 0, do nothing. And effect function, it can return a cleanup function. Or we can say returned cleanup. Does it return any cleanup? No. Actually, let me just write like that. Oh, like that. Nothing. Returned cleanup? Nothing. This is the first run of this useEffect. Are you with me? Next time the useEffect runs, so actually the cycle is like this, that when the useEffect runs, it cleans up after the previous time it ran. So I'm gonna move these two columns to the right, because the first thing that happens is cleanup. And the very first time it runs, there is no cleanup from previous time. There is no previous time. Next time, when start time is set to some value, what cleanup is run is the cleanup returned previously. And since we didn't return anything previously, nothing will happen here. But this is where stuff starts happening. So when start time is not 0, we create an interval. Effect is start timer, let's say. Start timer 1, because we might start many timers, right? This is the effect, start timer 1. And this effect here, when we enter this if statement, at the end, we return the cleanup function for it. So we say the returned cleanup is cleanup timer 1. Then, this is, now we're coming to what I really like, is that next time start time is changed, when it's set to 0 again, this is when cleanup timer 1 is run, because this is the cleanup function from the previous execution. So every time useEffect runs, it cleans up after the previous time, using the function that was supplied previously. This is what you need to understand here. It cleans up timer 1, and it looks here, start time is at 0, yes, then we don't do anything, no effect, and we don't return any new cleanup. And next time the start time is created, we just look here, is there any cleanup to run? No, but we create a new timer, start timer 2. This timer is already dead since before. And now we're starting a new game from a different start time. And then we return cleanup of timer 2. Start time changes to 0 again later. And this is when the cleanup of timer 2 happens. And so forth. So you see, this is a pattern that just repeats itself. Oh my God. This is going to repeat itself over and over and over again. And another thing is that if I started the game here, and and then I exit the component, then the cleanup function will run. Let's say here, I have started a timer, and then I leave the component. Then the cleanup will run, and the React framework will be happy, and it won't tell us that there is a memory leak. This is how it works. This is a lot to take in, I know. So let's just now see that this cleanup function works as I'm describing. Meaning that I'm going to refresh so that we start from 0. When I start clicking, the timer starts going. All right, and then it is waiting for the start time to become 0 again. And it happens when I press restart. So if I press restart, my timer stops. Another thing I need to do on restart is I need to set elapsed time to 0 as well. So the timer should stop, it should not tick, and it should become 0. Because we're showing elapsed time here. So click, click, it starts ticking. Restart, it's 0 and it doesn't tick. That's because it just has cleaned up after itself. It has removed the interval. So there, we have gone through useEffect and all its parts. Everything, I think, that there was to cover on this function, I have just covered. And now you have a very powerful tool for working with timeouts in components. And we have also implemented our timer. So we can see how long time has passed since we started playing the game. This is the milliseconds value that has passed. There are some bits and pieces that we haven't implemented yet. One is that the timer should stop when we win. Right now it only stops when we restart. And that's something that we will do tomorrow. We'll stop the timer when